Welcome to our Paranormal Afterlife. This is our Paranormal Afterlife, and I'm your host, Simon Bown. And you can enjoy the extended version of this episode ad-free, along with over 100 hours of extended episodes on Patreon. This week, I'm talking to Michael Schmicker about his book, What Comes Next? An investigative reporter uncovers quantum physics' hidden afterlife hypothesis. Investigative journalist Michael Schmicker started his career as a crime reporter for a Dow Jones suburban newspaper in Connecticut. He worked as a freelance correspondent in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War and was an op-ed contributor to the Asian Wall Street Journal. A nationally known writer on frontier science, Michael is the co-author of The Gift, ESP, The Extraordinary Experiences of Ordinary People. His first book, Best Evidence, has emerged as a classic in the field of scientific anomalies reporting. Hi, Michael. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, Simon.
So we're going to be talking about your book. It's called What Comes Next? An investigative reporter uncovers quantum physics' hidden afterlife hypothesis. And one thing you say at the beginning I was interested in, you said 19th century Newtonian science closed the door on an afterlife. So could you explain that?
Yeah, I think, let's see, how do I explain this? 19th century Newtonian science is based on a philosophy of materialism, okay? So even though it's science, it has a hidden philosophy behind it called materialism. And I guess the way to explain it is that materialism believes that only matter is real, okay? So that means that only things you can see, hear, taste, smell, or touch, in other words, things that have size and weight and shape, that's the only things that are real. And it's a philosophy. It's an untested philosophy. It's one of many philosophies. But unfortunately, Newtonian science, besides all the evidence-based science that they developed, they also wedded themselves to this philosophy, this untested philosophy. And the consequences for the afterlife question are pretty serious. Because if you say only matter is real, then that means our consciousness must also be made of matter. In other words, our thoughts, our self-awareness, and that is simply a product of the brain, the firing of neurons. But we all know that when the brain falls apart when we die, so when the brain falls apart, if there's no brain, there's no consciousness. If there's no consciousness, there's no afterlife. So basically, if you accept the philosophy of materialism, you're basically saying, logically, that an afterlife is impossible. So I think that's the way I would explain it.
So do materialists have a really good, solid explanation for how consciousness arises from the brain?
No, actually, they absolutely do not. And one of the points that's made in the book is the evidence is very, very strong that they fail. And I would put it this way. For the last 100 years, Newtonian science, classical physics, has been trying to explain how the brain produces consciousness. And they've been working on this for over 100 years. And the truth of the matter is they simply haven't come up with a way to explain it. It's called the hard problem in neuroscience. And it's not just me saying this. Nature magazine, one of the Nature journal, I should say, one of the most prestigious journals in the world, in 2023 or 2024, declared the same thing, that after a century of trying, they still haven't been able to understand or explain how or why the brain produces consciousness. So the truth is, there's zero scientific evidence that the brain produces consciousness.
So if materialists they do say that there's no such thing as an afterlife and consciousness dies with the brain, they're so sure of it, but actually they don't have any real proof. Is that right?
Exactly. In other words, the book I wrote really hammers home that point. There's a chapter called, I believe it's called The Hard Problem. And again, that's the term that neuroscientists use. There was an Australian philosopher, scientist named David Chalmers. He's now head of a mind body brain institute at New York University. He was the one that 20 years ago really forced the neurological community, the medical community, to face up to the fact that they had no explanation for this, and that the arguments that they were making, they often made correlation arguments. They could show that certain things, if you do certain things to a brain in this place, that certain things would happen. But as logic argues, a correlation is not causation. The two are different. They have no way of showing, or they have never come up with a way of showing how exactly the brain causes thought, causes our interior self-awareness. I mean, they would say that if everything is made of matter, how and if matter is primarily made of atoms, according to the classical physics, and they're just tiny lumps of dead matter, how does dead matter, and that dead matter doesn't have self-awareness? In other words, no classical scientist, Newtonian scientist, will say that atoms think or feel or analyze or feel empathy or spiritual thoughts and things like that. They would say, no, this is dead matter. Atoms are. If that's true, and we're only made of atoms, why do we? That's the hard problem that they simply haven't been able to explain. And the truth is, again, I think it's clear that, and again, the New York Times, Nature Journal, multiple scientific publications or qualified serious publications have pointed that out. They've tried and they've tried and they've tried, but there is zero scientific proof or explanation for how or why or when or where the brain produces consciousness.
So if we move then to quantum physics, what is it about quantum physics that suggests that our consciousness survives death?
Well, a couple of things. I mention it as a hidden hypothesis within quantum physics, and it's an indirect way that quantum physics strongly suggests that an afterlife is possible, and that's because quantum physics says at the most fundamental level of reality that reality is not made of matter. So quantum physics says materialism is false. And I cite 6 Nobel Prize-winning scientists, giants in the field of quantum physics, who all hold that position and explain that position and define that position in the book. And it's not me saying this. This is this group of extremely important quantum physicists who all say materialism is false. They include, Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger, Eugene Wigner, Brian Josephson from England. All of these people say that quantum physics tells us that matter is not fundamental, that consciousness is. In other words, consciousness and energy are the foundations of reality, not matter. So if consciousness is fundamental, if consciousness is not made of matter, when the brain dies, there's no reason scientifically or logically to say that consciousness disappears, because consciousness is not made of matter. It's not subject to falling apart like material things do. So that's quantum physics' big discovery, was that consciousness is fundamental, not matter. And once you say consciousness is fundamental, it's logical and possible that consciousness survives physical death because it's not made of matter. That's the heart of quantum physics, the indirect hypothesis that I found in quantum physics. But it's backed by top Nobel Prize winning scientists. The afterlife is not some sort of a paranormal woo-woo or something. It's just simply modern science. Modern science says that consciousness is fundamental, and if that's true, then an afterlife is both scientifically possible and logical.
So, is there a point where Newtonian physics works on matter, but then when you get to smaller and smaller things, you get the atom, then you get the parts of the atom, and then you get it's smaller than that, and Newtonian physics breaks down and it can't apply. It doesn't make sense when you look at the really small stuff.
Obviously, I write about it in the book, and I always feel better that somebody would look at the book, because when I try and explain it, I'm a journalist. I'm not a physicist. What I do is I find really smart people, physicists who do know their stuff. I ask them questions to the point where I get the answers that I can explain it to the layman. But let me try and explain it or describe it a little bit in this way. Classical physics works. Quantum physics doesn't say that classical physics is false. It says that classical physics' historical mistake in also assuming that only matter is real is a mistake. So what it's saying is that classical physics works. I mean, we see it every day. It works, forces and things like that. We see it work every day. So quantum physics doesn't, say that classical physics is no good. It just says that classical physics at its most fundamental level got it wrong. That at the most fundamental level of reality, the world is not made of tiny little lumps of matter. We always think of it like, you smaller and smaller as you get down to this tiny, tiny little piece of matter. The truth is, you don't get down to Newtonian matter at the most fundamental level of reality. You get down to energy. You get down to quanta. Quanta are packets of energy. And Max Planck, one of the founders of quantum physics, was the person who best explained how it works at the quantum level. I could give you his comment if you want. It's a pretty famous comment. Would you like that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So basically, Max Planck, Nobel Prize winning physicist, he coined the term quantum. It's a Latin term which means amount, and he is credited with creating quantum theory. And he summarized his answer to the reality question as what is reality made of at the most fundamental level in a simple sentence. And the sentence is this: I regard matter as derived or derivative from consciousness. Okay? So he's saying is that matter is created by consciousness. It's not the other way around. And according to Planck, consciousness working at the most fundamental level of reality shapes packets or quanta of energy into the physical things that we experience with our physical five senses. So consciousness is primary. It exists first, then matter. That was his insight and his explanation of how everything works.
I'm no tech genius, but I knew if I wanted my business to crush it, I needed a website now. Thankfully, Bluehost made it easy. I customized, optimized, and monetized everything exactly how I wanted with AI. In minutes, my site was up. I couldn't believe it. The search engine tools even helped me get more site visitors. Whatever your passion project is, you can set it up with Bluehost. With their 30-day money-back guarantee, what do you got to lose? Head to Bluehost.com. That's BLUEHOST.com to start now.
I'm not sure I should ask this next question because this one's probably unanswerable, but also it's like, how do we define what consciousness is?
Consciousness, there is a definition of consciousness. David Chalmers, the person who wrote about the hard problem that neuroscience faces. There's a number of different definitions, but here's what I think is a way to explain consciousness. Consciousness is subjective experiences that we have, okay? And they come in 3 or 4 forms, okay? So consciousness is the feeling of self-awareness, okay? So we sit here and we say, I think I'm aware. I think I exist. Okay? That's self-awareness. That's one form of consciousness. Reasoning and analysis are forms of consciousness. In other words, we reason, we look at things and we analyze and we choosing is a form of consciousness. These are all things. Thoughts are a form of, every thought that we have is a form of consciousness. Feelings that we have are a form of consciousness. So if we love or we hate or we dream or we desire or we have spiritual experiences, all of those things are inner subjective experiences, and collectively those are the manifestations of consciousness. And the difference is Newtonian physics says that only dead matter exists. The matter, to a Newtonian physics, matter doesn't think, feel, analyze, choose. It can't. It's simply dead matter. But consciousness is from self-awareness to emotions, to feelings, to thinking, to analyzing. Those are all forms of consciousness. In other words, you don't find those in atoms. If you have to ask a classical scientist, say, does a rock choose? Does a rock analyze? Does a rock feel pain? Does a rock love? Does a rock, have a spiritual experience? He'll say, absolutely not. And he says that we and the rock are made of the exact same things. We're made of dead matter. If we're made of dead matter, where does all this subjective feelings and emotions and thoughts come from? I mean, their argument is that it comes from the brain, but there's zero proof that there is. And the other thing is that quantum physics says, sorry, it's just not true. Reality is not made of matter. And then you get into all the quantum physics definitions of what reality is: superposition, entanglement, all these concepts from quantum physics that say that reality is radically different from the old Newtonian idea that the world is made of matter. It just simply isn't.
So have you always been interested in the afterlife and consciousness, or was there one particular thing that made you start getting an interest?
I never had any paranormal experience myself. I'm pretty much left-brained. I'm almost 100% left brain. It's embarrassing sometimes. But I did have a sister that had a near-death experience. I didn't know about it at the time because she was too embarrassed to tell the family. She thought we would think she was crazy, which is, when you say it, what's crazy is that we don't even accept people's descriptions of these things. But I think, as I mentioned in the book you probably read, I started out, I was raised with a religion of Catholic faith. I don't have any bad feelings about it. It was perfectly fine in many ways. I'm not angry about it. It wasn't some sour fundamentalist Christian thing. I mean, Roman Catholic Catholicism is, if you make a mistake, you can go to confession and get forgiven. I mean, it says that there's a loving God in control of things. So I didn't have a problem with it. But when I got to college, I took a comparative religion course and realized very quickly, that there's a million religions out there. I shouldn't say it. There's dozens of religions out there that you can choose from. So how do you choose? What do you use as the basis for choosing a religion, or even whether to not choose a religion? And so at a very early age, I decided that I was only going to live by evidence. So I demanded evidence. So what happened was that I looked at the Catholic religion and I said, virgin birth, Adam and Eve, immaculate conception, Satan, the archangel Michael, original sin. I didn't see any evidence, really strong evidence, scientific evidence for any of those things. And I looked at the other religions and I felt the same way. There just wasn't any evidence for all these religions. So I ended up becoming a Newtonian physics, classical physics, science-based person. I didn't like the conclusion because Newtonian physics, at least based on materialism, believes that there's no purpose to the world. There's no purpose to your life. There's no meaning to life. It's all pure chance. And I didn't like that, but at least it had some evidence from day-to-day physics that they were right. So I switched from religion to Newtonian physics. And for a long time, I lived with that, but I also majored in philosophy in college. So I knew that there were certain things that science couldn't answer. So I kept an open mind that there may be someday, some way, I would find some evidence for an afterlife. And I did find it indirectly. What happened was that I found out about some telepathy experiences that one of my relatives had, and I got interested in it, started investigating it. And from there, I got into investigating a whole range of paranormal phenomena, reincarnation, dowsing, even ghosts, poltergeists, things like that. And I was surprised at the amount of strong evidence for all these phenomena. And one of them was near-death experiences. And so once I got interested in near-death experiences, I found, to my conclusion, and which I describe in the book, why I believe it's so strong, I found extremely strong evidence from near-death experiences that our consciousness survives death. And I mentioned in the book, I mean, let me ask you, Simon, if how do you know that somebody's dead? How would you explain that to me?
I know there's the scientific thing, you might say their heart has stopped, the brain has flatlined. I'd say they're good indications.
If we're going to study near-death experiences, the first question is, how do you define death? And death, certainly, I think the basic thing is that if you have a flatlined brain waves from an EEG machine, and if you have flatlined electrical from the heart, EKG, then in most places in the world, that will allow you to say the person is dead. It's a definition of verified clinical death. And so if that happens, if anything happens under that state, then whatever is happening is in the state of verified clinical death. And what I found from a series of excellent studies was multiple cases of people who were in verified clinical death state who continued to observe and see and feel things around them. And when they came back from clinical death, they accurately described what they had seen while they were dead. And that's the first part of the book, really goes into 4 major studies done by some very famous people. Dr. Peter Fenwick in your country, in the UK, Dr. Pim van Lommel on the continent in Holland, Dr. Sam Parnia, who works at New York University, and Dr. Jeffrey Long, who started the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. And if you look at those studies, and I describe them in the book in some detail, it's hard to not conclude that during verified clinical death, consciousness continues for some people in those situations. So my feeling was at that point that this is strong scientific evidence. Let's not throw this away. You have to account for it. If you're going to be truly scientific, you cannot ignore this evidence. If you do, you're not a scientist. So if you look at this evidence, you have to explain it. You have to accept it. So that got me halfway there. So I said to my scientific friends, I said, look, here's the data. Here's the evidence. Why don't you accept it? And of course, a lot of them would just say, well, because it violates science. So the problem was, should we throw out the evidence or should we revise the science? So I was stuck for a while, but eventually I came across, because I was writing this book on scientific anomalies and consciousness, I came across quantum physics. And the deeper I read and the more I understood, I finally realized that quantum physics is the way to scientifically explain why an afterlife is both scientifically logical and possible. And that's when I changed my mind.
So you feature the Pam Reynolds case in your book. Could you go over that and tell us why that one's important?
There are multiple cases like this before I start. If you look at the scientific studies that have come out in the last 20 years, there's multiple cases, but this one's very, very famous. And basically, an American singer-songwriter, her name was Pam Reynolds Lowry, she underwent a risky brain operation at a neurological institute in Phoenix, Arizona in 1991, okay? And during that operation, her physician put her into full hypothermic cardiac arrest. That means they dropped her core body temperature to 60 degrees. They completely drained all of the blood from her brain and left her with no measurable heartbeat or brain waves, okay? And they're measured by EKG and EEGs, okay? But while she was in that verified clinical state of death, she found herself fully conscious, out of her body, floating above the operating table, where she looked down and saw the surgeon cutting her skull with an odd-looking bone saw. She didn't know what it was at the time, but she described it when she came back from her near-death experience. It was something she didn't know. It looked like an electric toothbrush, she said. She didn't know what it was, but it turned out to be a Rex bone saw. So she also heard nurses talking about how small her veins were and her arteries were. And so she was hearing and seeing while she was in a state of verified clinical death. Remember, she was hooked up to an EKG and an EEG, and all the blood had been drained from her brain. So, under Newtonian physics, there's no way that she should be able to see or hear anything at all. She was dead. She was literally, verifiably dead. And so after that, she continued through a classic near-death experience. In other words, a lot of people have heard this before. The people are familiar with some of the details that many people experience. She moved through a dark tunnel after leaving the operating room. Her consciousness, she sees a light. She meets and communicates with her dead grandfather and her uncle. And she finally returns to her body on the operating table. And then afterwards, she assumed that she had been hallucinating. So she herself thought that maybe this was a hallucination. But a year later, she mentioned the details to her neurosurgeon, a guy named Dr. Spetzler, and her account matched his memory of what. So when she said, I saw this electric toothbrush type thing, he said, oh, that's a great description of this Rex bone saw. When she said, I heard the nurses talking about how small my veins were and things like that, he had made a operating report, a detailed operating report, and he said, yeah, that correlated with what he himself remembered. But the interesting thing was that another physician, a guy named Michael Schmicker, an Atlanta, Georgia cardiologist, decided to study the case in great detail. And he went through the records, and he confirmed that Reynolds had no electrical activity in the brain, the neurons firing, during the time she said she was conscious and floating above her operating table, observing the bone saw operation. Okay? So likewise, at that time, she had no sight or hearing. Her eyes were taped shut and her ears were plugged. Yet her description, of what happened during the operation was both accurate and extremely detailed and couldn't be explained by lucky guessing. So it's a famous case for all those reasons. It's not the only case. There's multiple cases in the studies that I cite in the book I wrote. But this case is famous because it was very much debated, and it ended up as a book was written about it by Dr. Sabam, and the surgeon who operated on her and who did the notes or the operation, Dr. Spetzler, he confirmed that what she and Dr. Sabam had reported was accurate. And in 2009, a decade later, on National Public Radio in the U.S., he confirmed that her account matched his memory and the notes that he had made. And so basically said, from a scientific perspective, he had no explanation about how it could have happened, but it happened. So it's a very famous case. You'll find it cited in the literature. Most people outside of the interest in near-death experience won't know about it, but there's multiple cases like this.
Hello, Simon here. I conduct past life regression therapy sessions over Zoom, and these sessions can be very insightful and healing. If you go to my website, pastliveshypnosis.co.uk, you can book a free 20-minute consultation where we can discuss what it is you would like to achieve. You'll find the link to my website in the show notes. And you have a section in the book where you discuss the arguments that materialists put up against near-death experiences, and then you explain why those arguments don't work. Are there a couple you could explain to us?
You know, I don't have the book in front of me, but there's been about 25 different explanations put up by skeptics for why, for trying to explain the near-death experience. And they may say, well, there's oxygen deprivation, or it's fantasy, or it's endorphins. There's at least 20 or 25 that are covered in the book. But what I do is I cite these 4 studies, and at least 3 of the studies specifically go after those skeptic arguments and show how, in fact, they don't explain the situation. And so I made a point in the book to specifically cite medical doctors, medical researchers, well-known people like Dr. Fenwick and Pimba and Lowell and things like that, Dr. Sam Parney at New York University, who say, look, these explanations, you've got tons of them, but none of them explain the data. They don't explain the evidence that we've produced. They may have a piece of it here, a little bit there, but they don't explain the evidence. And particularly, they don't explain the out-of-body experience where someone sees something in a state of clinical death when there's no brain waves, there's no neurons firing when you're clinically dead. So the whole theory that the brain produces consciousness, it's falsified. If you have any case of anybody who can see and observe things in a state of clinical death, it scientifically falsifies the theory that the brain produces consciousness, because the brain isn't working.
And they sometimes think that they'll have one explanation, which might be low oxygen in the blood causing delirium and hallucinations. And they say, well, this one thing explains all near-death experiences, but that might explain one part of it, but it doesn't actually. But they think they can kill the whole near-death experience with one explanation for one part of it.
Well, it's not only that they can't explain the whole thing. Even when they do one thing, I could find it in the book if you want, but even if they do one thing, like the lack of oxygen being the cause of the near-death experience, explaining the near-death experience, as I think as Fenwick says, in many of these cases, there is no lack of oxygen. In other words, whatever they put up, these 4 books that I mentioned and the 4 research projects that I mentioned in the first part of the book, they really one by one, if you buy the books that are mentioned in my book, you will find why the specific skeptical arguments simply don't work. And so if somebody puts that out, my question to them is, explain the situation. Not enough to claim this. You have to go back and explain to me why Dr. Fenwick, Dr. Lommel, Dr. Parnia's, and Dr. Long's research is false. You can't just say you think that may be. They're giving you reasons why you're wrong. They're explaining why it can't be. So you need to face up to this data. Like I say, I'm a skeptic by nature, but I'm also a skeptic of skeptics. You can't just throw out ideas and walk away from it. You've got to explain the data, and the data in the book that I mentioned, in the books I cite, and the research reports I cite are very, very strong. So let's see what you got. skeptics.
Do you find that there's maybe some kind of shift happening amongst doctors and materialists, that they're coming more open to this?
Absolutely. No, I think that there's my guess is in the next 20 years that materialism will be on its way out. I think that there's a huge explosion of research into consciousness studies. I think consciousness has become the new frontier for science. I think that quantum physics gives a scientific basis for why we can logically and rationally move on from materialism. You finally have a scientific explanation that you can hang your hat on. Not only do you have the evidence, now you also have a scientific basis for consciousness being fundamental. I think there's a huge switch. I think it's accelerating. At least that's my research. What I conclude from my research.
So when you studied reincarnation, did you find something there that you thought was really strong in showing consciousness continues after death?
Yes, I did. I'll back up a minute. One of the first books I wrote was called Best Evidence, and the book looks at all 9 or 10 different paranormal quote unquote paranormal phenomena, and one was reincarnation. And if you look at the research that's being done, has been done, and is being done today by the University of Virginia in the United States, the evidence is strongly suggestive that reincarnation is a viable hypothesis, that not only does, like quantum physics, say that an afterlife is possible, the evidence for reincarnation, scientific evidence, anecdotal but scientific collected and analyzed evidence for reincarnation is extremely strong. The work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, Dr. Jim Tucker. I mean, this is first-class blue ribbon research. They don't overpromise. They don't overclaim. They just say, "Here's the data. Here's the experience. Now, you skeptics, have a go at it." But from what I've seen, when skeptics have a go at it, they usually fail because they tend to not really engage with the evidence. They tend to just say, well, it can't be, so therefore it isn't. That's not science. That's not science.
So if we look at the brain, the physical brain, it does seem to have something to do with consciousness. What do you think's happening there? What do you think the physical brain's role is in this?
Well, clearly, there's a larger philosophical question and there's a smaller question. But let's start with a smaller one. The brain clearly acts either as a filter or a transmitter of information. In other words, that the brain is absolutely critical to physical life. In other words, if you want to operate in the physical world, you need a brain. But the larger philosophical question is, do you need a brain in another state? In other words, is there a state other than the physical state of reality? And clearly, there is. There is a non-physical state. If nothing else, if you look at the near-death experience research, whatever that state is, when somebody's in verified clinical death, they're not in a physical state that we would normally accept as a physical state. When they're in that state, they're still functioning, and their brain is not functioning. So in that state, you don't need a brain. But in the state that we of physical life that we normally run, you do need a physical brain. So it's got a small and a large answer.
When your research and the things you're finding out about quantum physics, and this, it suggests an afterlife, but is it that all, that's as far as you've got? It doesn't confirm anything else, that there's a God or there's a specific afterlife place like heaven?
Yeah, I mean, you make a good point, and I make it in the book. In other words, quantum physics says that consciousness is fundamental. And if consciousness is fundamental, it means that it doesn't disappear when physical matter, dissolves or falls apart. But it doesn't say anything. All it says is that consciousness is fundamental, and that therefore the corollary to that is, if consciousness is fundamental, and afterlife is logical and possible. But it doesn't say anything about God. It doesn't say whether God exists or doesn't exist. It doesn't say it doesn't exist. It doesn't say it does. It's silent on it. It doesn't say that one religion is better than another. It doesn't say anything about religion, one religion or the other. It doesn't say anything about what an afterlife state is like. In other words, it doesn't say that, an afterlife is, a Buddhist nirvana, or a Christian harps and angels, or a American Indian great hunting land in the sky. It just says that there's no scientific reason or evidence to conclude that consciousness disappears when the brain dies.
So if we have these near-death experiences where people will have an out-of-body experiences, they'll see something that's later confirmed that's happening in the hospital or maybe away from a hospital, and then they go on to have a spiritual experience. But we can only confirm what's happened, say, on Earth, so to speak. But what does this confirmation of what they've seen say about the spiritual experience they have? Can that go towards verifying that in any way? Or is it still, we've got no idea?
Well, let's look at it this way. Let's set aside quantum physics for a moment and just look at the near-death experience, okay? So if quantum physics didn't exist and all the evidence we had was a near-death experience, I think the evidence from near-death experiences, not from quantum physics, but from near-death experiences, the evidence suggests, because it's reported again and again and again in near-death experiences, that you meet a divinity of some sort. Okay, so Bruce Grayson wrote a book called After. Dr. Bruce Grayson, one of the people at the University of Virginia, one of the people that started the International Association of Near-Death Experience Research, the foundation, giant in the field. And then Dr. Jeffrey Long, an oncologist who started the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. If you look at their data, it's just like collecting data for health or for epidemiology. If you look at collectively at the cases that they've collected and other near-death experience researchers, you're going to find that it's very, very common for near-death experiencers to meet a divinity of some sort. That divinity may be all different types of divinities, but it's an intelligence, a being, an entity, often described as a light, but also sometimes appearing as Jesus, as Buddha, as a Celtic god or a Kuan Yin from China or whatever. But the fact that people from all cultures and races and religions are reporting seeing or meeting a divine-like entity or being or intelligence or spirit that seems to take a personal interest in the person who's having the near-death experience, who expresses love to them, that's data. I mean, if you look just at the near-death experience data and you accept it just like you accept any collection of data from a health study or something like that, then yes, that strongly suggests that it doesn't suggest that your specific God is waiting for you, but it does suggest that there is some intelligent being who cares for you, who you have a good chance to meet in the verified clinical death state. And many NDE people experience that. If you accept the evidence, I mean, like it or not, if you accept the evidence, then yeah. But it doesn't say that the Christian God or the Hindu God or anything like that. It's a spiritual experience, spiritual in the broadest sense. It's not religious, but it's extremely spiritual.
And there are cases where people will be in that spiritual space and meet somebody, and then later on, when they're back on Earth, they find evidence that that person really did exist.
Clearly, I mean, there's a lot of things come out of the NDE experience, and certainly veridical or truthful information comes back from the state of death, comes back to the state of life, physical life, with evidence and information that can be verified. Not always, but it's certainly enough that it's more than possible. It's actual. Who knows why or how or what, but evidence is evidence.
Well, it's been great having you on the podcast. Thanks for being a guest.
Yeah, well, sounds good. Thanks, Simon, and good luck with your own book. I'll be buying a copy when I get off here.
Thanks a lot. This week I was talking to Michael Schmicker about his book, What Comes Next. An investigative reporter uncovers quantum physics' hidden afterlife hypothesis. And a great way to support the podcast is to join Patreon. You can now sign up for a 7-day free trial. The episodes are ad-free and are released 2 days before the free versions. You can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Our Paranormal Afterlife, or click on the Patreon button on my homepage at pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. The links are in the show notes. And my book on verified near-death experiences is on sale now on Amazon and all sorts of places, and you can get it on Kindle, audiobook, and on paperback. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review and be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via your favourite podcast app to make sure that you don't miss out on any episodes. And thanks for listening.